Last week, the 6500 XT launched from AMD, and it wasn't exactly well received. Can NVIDIA do any better with the RTX 3050? You bet they can. Let's do this. Hey kid, how you doing? What the hell is that noise?
What noise?
Is that your computer?
Oh, that noise. I've kind of got used to it now. That's my stock cooler.
Sounds like you need the MSI Core Liquid S360 with its 2.4-inch IPS display, latest Acoustics 7th generation pump, LGA 1700 support, and MEG Silent Gale P12 fans. You can't hear it coming.
Sorry, what? Can't hear you over this stock cooler.
Click the link in the description below and get one today. Sounds like you need it. Get it? So let me get one thing out there. This is a big one, and for a few very good reasons. Firstly, this is the card that's due to take on the 6500 XT, which in the grand scheme of things was a complete flop. The second is that this is the first desktop XX50 series card since the 16 series, where we still see the 1650 holding second place for the most popular GPU on the Steam hardware survey, and just behind it with the GTX 1050 Ti holding third place. So this kind of tells us that the 50 cards are kind of a big deal for consumers and for NVIDIA. The odd thing is, apart from on the laptop side of things, we never saw a 2050 and instead saw it being skipped, most likely in favour of the 16 series cards, kind of filling that void on desktop. Now, the other big thing is that this card is due to be kind of launched and be affordable at $249 MSRP. I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down on pricing specifics because what's the point these days, but we will see some cards at this price point tomorrow if you're watching this video at the time of launch. But likely we're going to see things rocket with 50% increases or above shortly after. Let's pretend that, for now you are able to actually get this card at its MSRP, and of course, having 5 models here, some will be launched at MSRP pricing. But some of the more, let's say, exotic models will be higher than that, in return for better cooling, higher boost clocks and whatnot. So generalizing, this is the lowest 30 series card on the market. And being a 30 series card means that you get all of the latest goodies like Ampere architecture, RT cores for ray tracing, and DLSS through the way of tensor cores and RT cores. Now, these are big selling points for NVIDIA, again, especially when comparing to the competition. And that's kind of something that I do want to touch on to. So we know that when it comes to pure rasterization, AMD's 6000 series managed to trade blows with NVIDIA, and in most of the latest titles, even beat the green team. But in other areas like ray tracing, NVIDIA have had the upper hand in this technology and overall title support. And while ray tracing is getting better, it does have that kind of trade-off when looking at the performance hit that it does kind of versus the benefit of stunning and immersive visuals. And that's where DLSS comes in. And in all honesty, even before testing this card, I knew this was going to be a fairly big factor on the 3050 to kind of make it competitive if wanting to use it to its full potential with ray tracing. So let's talk about kind of general specs of a reference RTX 3050. Where does it excel and what leads it to be the 6500 XT killer? And more importantly, from a spec standpoint, does it even make sense for the price of $249, making it $50 more than AMD? So to start with, it comes with 2560 CUDA cores, which in all honesty is a nice little bump up from the 1920 that the RTX 2060 had and the 2176 that the 2060 Super had. Sticking with the 2060 Super, we do find that the 3050 has the same 8GB of GDDR6 memory, but on a 120-bit bus compared to the higher 256-bit bus that the Super had. I'm not too bothered by this, so as it is still more memory and more bandwidth than the 6500 XT from AMD, which we kind of saw crumble under the pressure due to both of these factors. Anyone who's anyone knows that clock speed these days, it's not really the be-all and end-all. And while the likes of the 6500 XT did come with the fastest clock speed of any desktop GPU, that kind of further proved the point. And instead, having a balanced set of specs along with a nice level of boost clock that the card can stay at for a sustained level of time, this is what's going to give you better results overall. Think of it as less dips in the overall scene of a game, meaning that the all-important average frames per second will ultimately be higher. Hopefully that makes sense. Speaking of frames per second, it's time to see how the RTX 3050 did. So let's break out our trusty GPU test bench consisting of a Ryzen 9 5900X, Noctua D15S cooler, 32GB of Corsair DOM-Plat 3600MHz memory, and an Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard. Let's take a look at them glorious benchmarks. So let's start by talking about synthetics. The RTX 3050 gave us some interesting yet not surprising results in 3D Mark Firestrike, especially when comparing it to the GTX 1660 Super, considering the 1660 Super came out a little over 2 years ago. Maybe the lesser 120-bit memory bus could play a factor here, compared to the 192-bit bus of the GTX card. Hopefully NVIDIA aren't falling down the same trap as AMD with the 6500 XT. In Firestrike Ultra, the RTX 3050 did push forward, showing that the higher resolution benchmark is able to harness the true power of the Ampere architecture, and even sees it push slightly ahead of the 1660 Ti. This is likely due to the extra 2GB of GDDR6 memory that higher resolutions will be able to utilise, and shows that the extra memory was a good move by NVIDIA. When it comes to TimeSpy, we saw very similar results again between the 16 series GTX cards and the new 3050. From a first glance, anyone looking to upgrade for kind of pure rasterization performance isn't exactly going to be wowed by these numbers. With TimeSpy Extreme, we again see very similar differences between the NVIDIA cards. When comparing to the latest 6500 XT card from AMD, there's no real comparison. And again, the increase in memory bus and VRAM size clearly makes a huge difference in this benchmark. When it comes to ray tracing synthetic performance, it's towards the bottom of our stack, as we expected for its price point of $249, and still sits head and shoulders above the 6500 XT, which still kind of makes me question why AMD even bothered having ray tracing capabilities with their card. When comparing to the RX 6600, which has an MSRP of $70 more, it certainly shows NVIDIA as a viable alternative in ray tracing based performance. In Superposition, again, we saw very similar performance to the 1660 Super and 1660 Ti. Again, at this point, it makes it very hard for me to recommend this card to those looking to upgrade from a 16 series Turing-based GPU. So moving on to our first game with Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1080p on the high preset, and we see some pretty respectable numbers from the RTX 3050, with an average FPS of 65. In this newer title, we do see it slightly ahead of the older 16 series cards, and with quite a hefty jump over the recently released 6500 XT from AMD. At 1440p, we see the FPS drop to 48, but still showing a good value for money prospect over its Turing-based brothers in the 16 series range of cards, and again, keeping that gap between the 6500 XT. Moving on to Borderlands 3 on the medium preset, we have a lot of room to dial in some higher settings if we wanted to, at 111 frames per second, and a small but modest leap over the 16 series cards. Compared to the $50 cheaper 6500 XT, we see the 3050 taking a 46% lead over it. I mean, to me, that's easily worth the extra change for such a big jump. It's very much the same story at 1440p when comparing the cards from each camp, with a 51% performance lead going to the 3050. Again, when looking at comparisons to the Turing-based cards, we do see the RTX 3050 sitting ahead by between 5 and 10%. Again, further telling us that 8GB of memory really does continue to help at higher resolutions. Moving on to Dirt 5, a game that is generally favoured by AMD cards due to the work they've put in with the developer, but again, we see the 3050 push ahead with a lead of 27% over the 6500 XT. It's still interesting to see the 5600 XT with a 22% lead over the 3050, considering it's just celebrated its second birthday and has an MSRP, or had an MSRP, of $20 more than the RTX 3050 is launching with. At 1440p, the 3050 still keeps a healthy lead over the 6500 XT by 57% and sits under the 5600 XT by 19%, which is a little bit of a sticking point for me. Moving on to something a bit newer and Forza Horizon 5 on the high preset, and it's the same story all over again. You're probably starting to see a bit of a theme at 1080p with the RTX 3050 sitting between the two 16 series cards and sitting much higher than the 6500 XT. At 1440p, we saw the lead increase to 34% over the 6500 XT, and yep, you guessed it, extremely similar results between our Fab 3 cards, with a whopping 1 frame per second between them all. Looking at Godfall at 1080p on the high preset, we're over that 60 FPS number that most gamers aim for, and nothing too out of the ordinary. You will see that the 6500 XT bridges the gap a little closer in this test though, due to the game being geared more towards AMD hardware. Increasing to 1440p and it's all pretty much the same story. The 6500 XT trails behind and the 16 series cards are very similar in relation to the RTX 3050. Loading up Horizon Zero Dawn on the high preset, again, some pretty decent numbers at 79 frames per second, but again, we still see very similar performance to the 16 series cards, making this kind of a tougher one to push as an upgrade path, while still decimating the 6500 XT from AMD. At 1440p, it's the same story again, with very similar numbers between the 3050, 1660 Ti and 1660 Super, and a huge 71% advantage over the 6500 XT from AMD. In Watch Dogs at 1080p, I feel a little like a broken record when comparing the NVIDIA cards to each other, but we still see a very respectable 77 frames per second on the high preset. While the 62 frames per second on the 6500 XT is still a decent number, it really goes to show that it has some limitations. At 1440p, with a bit of tweaking to texture and lighting settings, you could easily push the 3050 over the 60 FPS threshold, showing that it can handle some of the most intensive games on high settings, even at larger resolutions. Finally, looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Being an older title, we tested it on the highest preset and were not disappointed, with 86 frames per second at 1080p. The only disappointing thing was that the performance, margin of error aside, was again nigh on the same as the 16 series cards. Still a hefty jump over the competition though, but that 16 series performance is a real sticking point and I just can't shake that off. Moving up to 1440p, we're very close to the magical 60 FPS number that all gamers crave, and while ahead of the 1660 Super, it is by a very small margin, but does leave the AMD 6500 XT in its dust as expected. So performance was okay. I mean, it was good, but not exactly groundbreaking when comparing to some cards that have been out on the market for quite some time. Where things do get interesting is, remember, this card has both RT cores and Tensor cores. With that in mind, we loaded up Dirt 5 using the same high preset as before, but enabling ray tracing shadows. And we saw the FPS drop from 77.1 to 65.4 on the RTX 3050. Funnily enough, giving us similar performance to its bigger brother, the RTX 3060. At 1440p, it was a similar story, seeing the FPS drop slightly from 59 without RT shadows on to 50.4, but still being very close in performance to the RTX 3060. We like to be as transparent as possible with our testing, so in Godfall at 1080p on the high preset, we saw enabling ray tracing to have no effect and instead saw a margin of error result of around the same. At 1440p, this was exactly the same, and while ray tracing does make a difference on AMD cards, doesn't seem to do anything in terms of ray tracing hits on NVIDIA hardware. Next, we loaded up Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, which has ray tracing enabled as standard, and saw the RTX 3050 deliver 50.71 frames per second at 1080p with the high preset. At 1440p, I wasn't expecting miracles, but was still pleasantly surprised considering how intensive this game can be. I mean, is it even worth commenting on the 6500 XT's performance here? Probably not. When enabling DLSS and running the same benchmark at 1080p, we did see the performance jump to 63 frames per second, giving us a 25% leap from having it disabled, and at 1080p, I couldn't really notice any visible grain in the scenes. Enabling DLSS at 1440p, we did see a slightly larger kind of disparity of 36%, but it still fell short of that 60 FPS number. Again, you could dial down some of the settings to make it kind of a little bit more achievable on a card that's meant to be $249. That is pretty impressive. Finally, when looking at Watch Dogs Legions with ray tracing on, we saw quite a huge 53% dip when enabling ray tracing, taking it from 77 frames per second to 36 at 1080p. While ray tracing adds some amazing visuals, this is a bit too much of a hit for me. Enabling DLSS brought this back up slightly to 51 frames per second, but in my opinion, you'd want to dial the main settings down a bit to increase the FPS or simply turn ray tracing off. At 1440p, we saw a similar story with the frame rate more than halved when ray tracing was enabled, and while DLSS again picked those figures up slightly, it's still not enough to give you a fluid gameplay experience overall. But I wasn't really expecting that in this game, at these settings, at 1440p. So overall, performance is good. It's much better than the 6500 XT as we expected, and definitely offers up a better value for money prospect compared to the 6500 XT. if these cards sit at their MSRP, which in all honesty, we all know they won't. When it comes to ray tracing performance, certain titles were able to utilize the technology well, and DLSS helped to make it not only visually stunning, but playable and fluid at the same time, which for a card that's set to be $249, I think that makes it, frankly, a bargain. The issue is these cards, while some of them are being touted as MSRP cards, it's really down to you to kind of evaluate for yourself as to if it's worth it for you. And as I have 5 different cards here, let's go through them each, bit by bit, in a little bit more detail. Starting with the EVGA XC Black. This is set to be an MSRP card, coming in at $249. With a dual fan design that definitely has a kind of unique style in terms of the blades, it's also a fairly low profile card in the grand scheme of things. With ITX cards coming onto the market from other brands, it's still, I guess, slightly larger than those, but offers up everything you'd expect from an RTX 3050 GPU core, while staying cool and, frankly, quiet at the same time. EVGA will also be releasing a similar OC model, which features, as the name suggests, a higher boost clock and a backplate. Moving on to the Gigabyte Gaming OC. As the name suggests, it's a pre-overclock card, straight out of the factory, and comes with the tried and tested Windforce cooler that we've seen on previous generations. It's the largest of the cards that we have here, while still remaining kind of fairly slim and not too tall either. It's the only triple fan cooled card that we have here, and they're generally kind of regarded as great for keeping the GPU cool without making too much noise. This card, being a gaming OC, will obviously be more than MSRP, but Gigabyte will also have an Eagle card that will be MSRP pricing. The next model up is the Inno3D Twin X2 OC. The name again kind of gives it away, with it being a card that has a set of twin fans and being an OC model. We've not been told concrete pricing on this, but it's safe to assume that being an overclock model, it will come in likely around $20 more than MSRP. Again, much like the EVGA, it's a 2-slot card and is quite small overall. I mean, we don't actually get that many Inno3D cards in the UK, so it's nice to see another one in our offices. The Palit Dual OC certainly has a unique style to the cooler, with a kind of ribbed black plastic shroud that kind of dents a little bit in the middle. I thought the 5700 XT from AMD was the last card that we've actually seen with a weird dent in it, but here we are. It features 2 large fans and is kind of a very similar size to the other cards, with a 2-slot design and a full backplate. There is no word on pricing on this, but with Palit releasing a Storm card at MSRP, you could likely see this around $20 to $50 or pounds more than MSRP. Lastly, the Zotac Twin Edge. This is, in theory, and I say that very lightly, this should be an MSRP card. It's not quite as small as the EVGA XC Black, but it's still a very small card and perfect for smaller form factor builds. With 2 large fans and the same twin slot design as all the other cards, it comes with a full backplate and should be able to keep up kind of where it matters. Speaking of that, when it comes to noise levels, all the cards perform very similar, with only a couple of decibels between them. The Zotac was the quietest, while the Gigabyte was the loudest, which was expected as it's the only model with a triple fan design, while the others only feature 2 fans. It was a very similar story when looking at the total power draw of the system during a run of the Superposition synthetic benchmark. What is interesting though is that the Inno3D was very close in total power draw at load, especially considering it's a dual fan card. So what about temperatures? Well, at load, Palit was the hottest out of all 5 cards. Saying that, even at 67 degrees in an open air test bench, it's nothing really to worry about. So what do I think overall? I mean, it's a good card, as I mentioned, and I did have a chat with NVIDIA about why we didn't run these tests with resizable bar enabled. We obviously like to keep things as fair as possible and compare apples to apples, and maybe we'll revisit in the future to kind of show a difference. Without it though, we did expect maybe a little bit more in pure rasterization performance, especially when comparing to the Turing-based 16 series cards. Kind of finding it a tough one to recommend if you're looking for an upgrade path from the 16 series, unless ray tracing and DLSS is absolutely vital for you. The other way to look at it though is, what other choices do you have? The RTX 3060 is over double the price at retailers, if you can find it at all, and as we saw from the results today and last week, the 6500 XT just isn't a viable option for anyone, especially when looking at ray tracing performance. What I'm trying to say is, it's good, but I personally maybe wanted just a little bit more, especially for those wanting to upgrade on older hardware. Most people keep their old motherboards and CPUs and simply upgrade their graphics card. So resizable bar isn't going to help you unless you have the latest CPU and motherboard platform. If you do, are you then going to be buying a $250 GPU? I'm just trying to get my head in the psyche of the consumer. It's probably not going to happen, right? If you're on an even older GPU, then yes, this is without doubt the best value graphics card you can buy right now, or after the launch tomorrow that you can't buy, if previous launches or anything to go by. It's a tough one. If it was me and I was spending cold hard cash, knowing that the way that the market goes, I'd be tempted to spend up to around $300 on one of these. But once it gets past that, then I'd be asking myself other questions. And the main one is, what does this give me over a 1660 Super? Yes, it gives you ray tracing and gives you DLSS, which in most titles is going to be essential if you're wanting the benefits of the RT cores at the same time. And well, with 1660 Super still going secondhand for $350, £350 and above, this card is better value than them. But who's to say that when this card launches on retail shelves, which is 24 hours from the launch of this, the 16 series don't plummet in value on eBay and make it even easier to buy, because we all know getting hold of any GPU is tough right now. But do you know what is easy to buy? The eTeknix PC Maintenance Toolkit, with everything you need to build, repair and maintain your PC. It's the only toolkit you'll ever need. Grab yours over on store.eteknix.com today. And with that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know exactly what to do, and hopefully you preferred the analysis over the charts instead of, music. Let me know if you did. Also, if you want to see more performance figures on each of these cards individually, head over to the written reviews over on eteknix.com. Links are down below. And if you want to support us, you can do so through Patreon. Again, that link is down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.